Welcome to Internally Guided Life, a podcast to help you unlock a life of balance, fulfillment, and joy. I'm Kayla Sweet, and together we're going to have fun and create change from the inside out. I'm so glad you're here. Hello, my friends. Welcome back. I am so excited for today's episode. We are going to be talking about something that I've personally had to navigate for all of my life than I could remember, which is perfectionism. But we aren't going to stop there. We're also going to dig into the way that navigating and healing through our perfectionism can lead us to some inner power and to some inner leadership and some untapped resources if we do it the right way. So this is going to be a really nourishing conversation, and we have an amazing guest joining us to help us have this exploration. We have Dr. Tara Cousineau, and she is a clinical psychologist, a perfectionism recovery coach, and the author of The Perfectionist Dilemma, which I have started reading, and so far so good. I'm really enjoying it. There's a lot of underlines. But her work bridges science, mindfulness, compassion, and just a really deep groundedness and a perspective that really helps us to understand how to heal from the inside out and how to make peace with all of the parts of ourselves. So I am very connected with her work and so excited to hear what she has to share today. So with that, welcome, Tara.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
It's going to be great. So before we dig into the amazing work you're doing, the things that I'm learning about in the book, I would love to hear a little bit about who you are and what brought you here, however much you want to share.
Okay, I'll try to keep it short. As you said, I'm a clinical psychologist. I do practice therapy. I have a private practice and I work half-time at Harvard University's Counseling Center. And whether it's private practice or working at a university, I am always having conversations with high achievers, people who are striving for excellence, and people who really also struggle with getting in their own way sometimes. And the reason that I wrote the book was in part because I was like, I have to do something to get more people in a room together, essentially. People who identify as perfectionists don't actually broadcast that they're having any kinds of challenges. But if I could get them in a room together, maybe we could actually discuss it and have conversations about it. So I started running these workshops called Overcome Perfectionism Through Self-Compassion. And then I have a little offshoot on befriending the inner critic. And through doing those workshops and meeting with lots of young people, emerging adults, emerging leaders, essentially, I just kind of put it all together into this book, The Perfectionist Dilemma. And what I hope that I can convey to you and to the readers is that, perfectionism is a complicated experience. It's not your fault. It's based on a lot of conditioning, sort of these internal algorithms, past experiences, disappointing life experiences, expectations, all those kinds of things. And it's understandable that people would want to adopt that kind of approach in life. It makes sense, actually. But it doesn't always work well because there is a point of diminishing returns.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a powerful statement too, because it helps us initially kind of, right? Like it serves us
Yeah.
well until it doesn't. And I know that from personal experience, the perfectionism really I felt like I thanked it a lot for the things it did for me for many years until I burned out and I realized it wasn't sustainable anymore.
Yeah, exactly, which is really my story. I was in my mid 30s. I just achieved my PhD. I had two small children, and I was on this hamster wheel of doing, producing, performing, trying to publish my dissertation. start a new business, be in private practice for the first time. And the tension that arose finally got me, and it kind of, really got me face planted on the ground, quite literally, where one day I was out in the backyard, we're doing a family barbecue, and I started just feeling these shooting pains down the right side of my face and arm. And I was just convinced I was having a stroke in that moment. It was just this like immediate experience of this knowing that I was going to die in front of my kids. And I turned to my husband, dropped the utensils, and said 911. And next thing you know, I was just carted off in an ambulance in front of my confused family. Of course, I wasn't having a stroke or a heart attack, but I did actually develop a chronic pain condition called trigeminal neuralgia. And it was partly because my face was just so tense and my jaw was so
Mm,
tense. It took months and months and months to figure out what it was. It was a dentist who identified it, thank God. And that began sort of a journey of self-care, trying to find some sort of balance in life and see how I could let up somewhere in my life that was just very, very full. So that was sort of one of my stories. But then I began to work with people who were having similar experiences, whether it was self-sabotage at work or overproducing and then making mistakes, or maybe it was IBS or migraines or chronic insomnia, something that just alerted people that whatever they were doing in their life wasn't working.
mhm. Yeah, because it shows up some way or another, whether it's yeah, the exhaustion or these physical manifestations, very real illnesses, the
Yes.
stress is just toxic to our systems.
Absolutely. And so that's what I talk about. It's like it's a mind, body, heart, spirit, you know, situation where really everything is connected. And um, so that kind of launched me into actually the whole area of mind body medicine. And that's really what I've been immersed in for many, many years.
Yeah, I just love your approach too because it's it is this beautiful blend of science and these deeper wisdom structures and ways of thinking and believing. You have a very holistic approach, I guess, is what I'm kind of finding my way to here in the evening as my words start to escape me. But what did that look like for you to find this well-rounded approach that integrates all of these different perspectives?
Well, I have to say, Kayla, it was really a lot of trial and error. And I mean, I now feel like, well, I'm a pretty seasoned clinician. I've been doing this for 25 years. I've been able to see what works, what doesn't work. My clients and students are my best teachers, honestly. And so when I start hearing their feedback over and over again, that these certain tools or skills or ways of shifting their attitudes is what's working, then that is what I stick with. Then I'm like, okay, there's a formula here. And so that's how I came up with sort of a method, if you will, to follow. I do blend. I mean, I am very much on the sort of mind body spectrum in terms of the importance of mindfulness. And when that first came on board about 30 years ago, it was really considered woo-woo. There wasn't any research behind it. I remember my dissertation chair even just said, thought that I was aloof and not serious about my work because I was going off and doing a 5-day retreat. And I feel like it's that's come into its own. And now there are tens of thousands of research papers on the effectiveness of mindfulness in almost every domain of life. And then about, I would say, 10 years ago, the same thing happened with the research on self-compassion.
Mm,
And I really actually believe that self-compassion is the best elixir, if you will, for a lot of life's ailments. And that research actually is pretty much saying, listen, you start to incorporate yourself in compassion practices, your mental well-being is going to improve. And that's now also pretty much demonstrated. And they've even got scientific studies and brain imaging studies that show which parts of your brain light up. And when you start practicing loving kindness, you start getting more flexibility in certain areas, things, everything's networked essentially. And And that's actually very promising to me. And now I feel like we're also at this other inflection point, if you will, with energy psychology and energy medicine, which is actually, I mean, all of these practices are rooted in ancient wisdom.
Yeah.
We just didn't have the tools to measure them, right? And so
Uh-huh.
as the tools arrive, to measure changes, in the body and the mind, now we say, oh, it works. But of course, ancient practitioners have known this forever.
Yeah, isn't that so funny? We
Yeah.
have to have a way to measure it. We can't just believe the results.
Right. Which is actually my point with my clients and students. I say the best evidence is your own lived experience.
Yeah. So, oh my gosh, so many good things already. We've got mindfulness, we've got self-compassion, and I realized that I didn't even get your definition of perfectionism. So let's maybe circle back for a second and lay some foundation. What is perfectionism? How do you define it? I think we know what it is, those of us who have this affliction or have done some work around this, but how do you relate to it in your work?
Yes. Well, I'll give you my definition and then I might say what the research says about it.
Okay.
But my perfectionism is that it's the paradox created by the need for belonging or fear of rejection, paired with unrealistic expectations for achievement and approval that sap your energy or life force.
Mm, that, yeah, I feel that.
Yeah, and I think that some of the definitions get at the cognitive issues and the social issues around perfectionism. I mean, researchers who look at this, and there's beautiful research on perfectionism that shows that it's been on the, increase for the last 30 plus years. They sort of compartmentalize it as there's socially prescribed perfectionism, which I just call the compare and despair perfectionism, is that your yardstick is really what other people are doing. It's the rating and ranking culture that most youth grow up in today. You're looking for sort of external validation for your sense of self-esteem and self-worth. And then there's self-oriented perfectionism, which is really you are creating your own bar, right? You keep setting your own bar higher and higher and higher. And it doesn't even matter what other people say. You have your own criteria. I would say that I probably would fall sort of under that bucket. I became this little high achiever in middle school. If I couldn't fit in with the popular girls, then I was going to be really smart, and so
Mhm.
overcompensated in some ways. And then there's other oriented perfectionism. And I feel like a lot of the cliches around perfectionism is under this type. It's where you expect other people to be perfect and
Mm.
flawless. If you think of the characters in movies like, The Devil Wears Prada, the Meryl Streep character, Miranda, demanding that everybody else, be perfect. But we have sort of blends of all of these things. But I feel like what runs across all of them is that it's exhausting. On one way or another, it's depleting. So
Mhm.
I really wanted to get that element in my definition of it. So that's why I say it saps your energy or your life force, because I think that it does over time.
Yeah. Well, I experienced that very much so. Like I mentioned, I got to burnout and you got to that place of like that physical depletion and your body telling you like this is too much. It does something to you when you're trying to push yourself beyond what is realistic. And I think it's hard when you're someone who has a high value
Mhm.
for your work ethic or for excellence or for striving. But then perfectionism is when it reaches this like toxicity with it, right? Where it's like no longer healthy for you or the people around you. Parse that around a little bit for me when we think of like perfectionism versus just wanting excellence and striving for quality.
Yes. Well, it's so interesting. There is research on this. Patrick Gardrove, if I'm saying his name right, in Canada, describes the point of diminishing returns when you are striving for a goal. And with perfectionism, there's this point where your efforts no longer are serving you, right? That's either depletion or burnout, like you say, or that you're more prone to make mistakes, or that little extra effort actually doesn't get you any farther ahead, right? So there's a point of diminishing returns. Whereas striving for excellence, or what he would call excellencism, is you're still striving for excellence, but you enjoy the process of learning, right? You're not so tightly wound. You're flexible. It doesn't have to be a straight path. It could be more of a windy path towards that goal, and you're enjoying the process or you're getting something out of the process. And so that's healthy. I mean, I wouldn't even say that there's necessarily healthy perfectionism. I would say that's healthy striving, health,
Yeah.
you know, but perfectionism and ism is an extreme, right? The ISM and perfectionism, that's like a dogma, that's an extreme. Um, and it just leaves you really vulnerable over time.
Yeah. I mean it makes perfect sense to me because I think of like when I was in school, for example, and I was still very much in my perfectionism and everything's on this graded scale, and if I got a 99 out of 100, it felt like a failure because of that one. I couldn't see the positive that was there, whereas many people would have been celebrating that kind of a mark. For me, it felt like a personal failure that I would beat myself up over incessantly and exhaust myself over what I could have been proud of, learn from the one thing I missed and move on with my life.
Exactly. I hear these stories every single day.
I'm sure you do.
You're not alone.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's a hard one to overcome too. How do you guide people
Yeah.
through that to move towards the mindfulness and the self-compassion and out of the ism?
Yes, exactly. Well, people say this all the time. I even got this question this week when I was doing one of my sessions in the group. And this young woman was saying, well, my perfectionism has helped me. It's gotten me this far. I can't give it up. I need it. I need it for the structure. And I completely understand that. But I said, okay, I want you to check in with how are you feeling? Like, let's just drop into your body. When you're on this path of perfectionism, how are you feeling? And of course, she's like, well, terrible. I can't sleep at night. I worry. And I said, okay, but when you are really inspired by a project and you want it to work out well and you're enjoying it, what's the difference? And and that really stops people in their track. They actually have to think about it. Like, oh, well, it was a group project. It was a really great collaboration. It was fun. Like all of a sudden you start seeing this wellspring of sort of, more beneficial experiences. So when people say, well, what's the difference? And I say, well, check in with your body. If your body is tense, if you're upset, if you're losing sleep, if there is pain, then it's not working for you.
Mm.
Now, procrastination, I say, is the near sister of perfectionism because what is very common is there's this sort of internal, if you will, like polarization, like a tug of war, is that you've got this part of you that's really striving to achieve the highest mark or some sort of excellent result. And then another part that is exhausted or is actually just really afraid that you're not going to do well or you're going to get judged in some way. And it causes that freeze response, right? So you've got part of you in fight flight, this sort of hyper energy zone. And then another part of you that's dragging you down because you're really afraid.
Mm.
And you have this failure anxiety, and then you don't do anything, and then you're spinning in place. So I get a lot of people who are just like, I'm stuck. And that's my clue like, oh, there's an internal polarization. There's the,
Mm.
it's the doing and the undoing. It's the yes, no, should I, shouldn't I?
Yeah. Yeah, or I think of like the things I didn't do because I didn't think I'd be perfect at them. Like I wouldn't even give myself permission to do something that I didn't think I could do the best, to be the best at.
Exactly. I mean, I remember that exact thing in college where in my mind, I didn't know enough about the field of psychology or psychiatry, honestly. But I had neighbors who were psychiatrists and they were sort of mentors for me in a way. I was like, all right, I'm going to become a psychiatrist. And then I got to college and had to take organic chemistry and it just bombed. I mean, it was the worst class I ever took. And the professor was foreign. I didn't understand. And the office hours were not helpful. And I was like, all right, I can't do it. And I just dropped the class. Now, when I step outside of that whole situation, I feel like, well, I probably lost an opportunity, but actually, I don't think I really wanted to go to medical school. But I really did want to be a therapist or a healer, and there are other paths to it. But
Mm.
I stopped myself short, you know, because something was really hard and I wasn't going to be an easy A. This is a story I hear all the time as well. Oh, I'll take a pass fail, or I'm going to withdraw that class. This is the last week I can withdraw the class because you're not getting the marks that you want, which is too
Hmm.
bad because then you're not actually experiencing how to work through these kinds of challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. And then once you get into whatever workforce you're going into, one, your ability for assessment becomes very different. That was something I really struggled with in we're entering the workforce. I didn't have anyone giving me an A or an A plus or 100% to know if I was doing good or not. So my bar just kept getting higher and
Yes.
higher and higher.
Exactly. And then when you don't know what the guardrails are or the guidelines or whatever the criteria are, that's actually when the inner critic will just shoot right in.
Hmm.
You start coming up with your own stories and your own narratives.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this is this is just it's nourishing for I mean even little p parts of my current self, but especially my past self. I think of how many years I just really suffered. And this is something I catch myself, even though I've done work around it. There's definitely still moments where it's like I spent way too long on that thing that was good enough 2 hours ago, you know? But
Exactly.
I love
Yeah.
your check-in with the body though. That's a good reminder, I think, to say, and am I in healthy striving or am I in perfectionism? Like, is it painful? Am I pushing myself? Am I constricted? Am I uncomfortable?
Yeah, and it's important to learn to navigate tension and pain, right? I mean, that's what we call in psychology that window of tolerance. Like we want to be able to broaden the window of tolerance, but it can't be your way of living
Mm,
all the time to have this high level of tension and distress. That is just going to produce cortisol in your body. That's never good because that's going to cause inflammation, and everybody's body produces different ailments. That's when people come in, they're like, well, I've got IBS and I've got this too. I'm like, yeah, I
um,
get it. No wonder. Your body can't tolerate all of this inflammation that you're producing through these stressful habits of mind.
yeah. How do you know the healthy ratio? Because I've had another guest I talked to not too long ago about bravery and pushing yourself and embracing the discomfort. And I'm for that too, because I love growth. And like you said, you can't live in that place because the body and the mind and the soul, they grow weary and then you're exhausted and you've got all this cortisol. How does one navigate
Yeah.
the balance?
It's a good question. This is where I draw on sort of the teachings in mindful self-compassion, where basically if you think of like three concentric circles, if your listeners could imagine this, and on the outer circle is overwhelm, right? When we're really overwhelmed, it's impossible to actually learn anything new. It's very difficult to take in new information, and it's hard to kind of connect to the executive functions and make, reasonable choices and decisions. In the middle ring, in the middle circle, is being safely challenged. So there's sort of this optimal level of pushing yourself, but in the whole, you're feeling like it's all good. Like you got this. If you fail, there's a safety net in some way. The middle is, the safe circle. And that is really great to dip into when you need to nourish yourself and sustain yourself, but you don't learn in that space either, right? So it's really learning how to kind of travel or navigate that middle ring, if you will, of being safely challenged. And yeah, it's sometimes hard to know, but when you're in overwhelm, you kind of know
Yeah, for sure.
it, right? And then you got to sort of dial some things back.
Uh-huh. Yeah, get yourself back to some equilibrium if you've pushed too far.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's a great visualization to imagine, the rings. If you're staying in that center one, you're not giving yourself permission for that expansiveness, even that growth to push your limits and to become something new or to learn something new. But if you're constantly in overdrive, then that's not sustainable. So trying to be able to navigate that. And I mean, for me personally, even to this point, I feel like it's a little bit of back and forth where I've just found a flow where I like to push and I like to do and I like to achieve and I like to learn. And then I notice I'm getting tired and then
Yes.
I have to slow down and I go into a different rhythm for a little while. I backtrack and nourish myself, fill myself up, and then I get, restored in my energy to do the next thing.
You have to dip into that. You have to dip into that restoration. The brain needs it, the body needs it. And it's one of the hardest things for people who identify as perfectionistic to do that because they feel like they're always trying to maximize time. And if they do some self-care, or have dinner with friends, they're taking away from time that they need to produce, to perform, whatever it is. And that is almost one of the biggest challenges is to convince people that they actually need to do what I call, as being in the green zone of, vitality and nurturance. That is hard for people to do because in part the body has habituated to that high stress level so that when all of a sudden you're calming your nervous system, your body's actually freaking out. Oh no, Tara is calm. This is not right. This is very unfamiliar. Maybe there's something wrong. And then all of a sudden you climb back up into that crazy hamster wheel zone because that is more familiar. It doesn't mean it's good for you. So we have to really kind of monitor, our sort of our stress levels, if we're dipping into this sort of red zone of, fight flight or kind of flatlining into paralysis. And I do think that checking in with your body is the easiest way, but a lot of people don't want to do that or they haven't done it. I
Or they
should,
don't know how.
they don't know how, they
Yeah.
don't have the tools yet. Yeah, exactly.
Where do you suggest someone would start with the body check-ins to just like start to cultivate some body awareness if they're wanting to clue into that as a signal that, maybe they've pushed too far.
Yeah, well, this is where mindfulness practice comes in, even doing a simple body scan, helping people identify, where in their body they're feeling maybe some tweakingness or some tightness, or maybe they're not actually feeling anything at all. But to really just begin to get curious, right? There's no right answers here, but to start to kind of tune in. Um, when I teach mindfulness or, a basic practice is helping people identify what is their attention anchor. Is it the rise and fall of their belly or the rise and fall of their chest or the sensation of breath through the nostrils? People can start to tune into that. And when they do, they start to make that connection in some way. So simple body scans are really helpful. Where do they notice the aches and pains? What hurts today? Um, and then, are there feelings associated with that sensation? Right? It's trying to get into a little bit of a more language of emotion,
Mm.
tension, irritation. I say overwhelm is not a feeling, it's an experience of a lot of unidentified feelings in the moment.
Mm.
So just start to name the feelings, start to get a little bit more granular around that. And then what are the thoughts? And the thoughts are usually self-disparaging inner narratives. So it's really helping people to tie all of these experiences together as a way just to self monitor. You don't need body gadgets for this. It's just literally a checking in.
Yeah, you just have to give yourself the the permission and the space to notice for a minute or
Right,
two.
right. That sacred pause, as the meditation teacher Tara Brach calls it. You got to do the sacred pause many times a day.
Mm. So something that this is making me think of, I think of back when I first started to work through some of my own, healing journey or however you want to frame it. And I encountered mindfulness first. And I was very enthralled by it, and I was kind of obsessed with it. But I also was struggling to practice it initially because as soon as I quieted my surroundings, the voices in my mind were much louder, and I could hear those. And so for me, like yoga kind of helped me to move through that because it gave my body something to do with that
Totally.
stillness that I couldn't quite sit with yet. What are your thoughts on that? Is that like a normal experience?
That's a totally normal experience. Our brains are just really busy. They're stress producing machines. And when we actually tune into it, sometimes it's like, oh, wow, that is a lot.
Hmm.
And so for some people, mindfulness isn't the first entry point. It is something more like a rhythmic movement, swimming, yoga. That's my go-to. I've been doing that for 30 years. I know that's my happy place because yoga, I think, is the perfect physical activity because you have to breathe, you
Hmm.
have to focus, and you have to rest. It's like the perfect combo. But people can find their other ways, being out in nature, and just taking in the sensations. Like there's many ways to do mindfulness practice. It doesn't have to be sitting quietly for 20 or 45 minutes. It could be a mindful walk. It could be noticing the sounds. Actually, I recently taught a mindfulness class, and you always ask people, what did you practice this week? And this one person said, I realized that I just needed to, go on a walk quietly and challenge myself to find or notice something new today.
Mm.
That's beautiful. As to kind of just really kind of get grounded and situate your body in space, right? So there are many different sort of entry points in, but for many people, mindfulness backfires because their mind is too busy. They say that they don't have the time, then they give up. They're not doing it the right way. Like, how perfectionistic are you? As if there's a perfect way to do
Uh-huh. I was just about to say that last one. Like now that I'm reflecting back,
it.
there might have been some perfectionism showing up around, yeah, how is it supposed to look? How is it supposed to feel? Because now, I walk around my yard for 5 minutes barefoot and I'm like, oh, mindful moment, like perfect. But
Yes.
back then it felt like it needed to be a very specific way.
Right, right. We all have these ideas of what we're supposed to be doing. So I always tell people, this is actually where the apps can be helpful. Listen to different voices, listen to different meditation scripts, find something that you can resonate with. And then I bring in the science because people need a little bit of proof. So there's been research. This is Anisha Jha's research. She tested basically a typical mindfulness protocol with peak performers. So we're talking like Navy SEALs and professional football players. And for a month, asked them to do 30 minutes a day. Well, did they do 30 minutes a day? No, they didn't. But they were monitored, and and they filled out all these surveys, and they crunched the numbers. And basically, the sort of minimal effective dose time-wise of mindfulness is 12 minutes to have
Mm.
the health benefits, the mental well-being benefits. And I'm like, okay, can you give yourself 12 minutes? And people say, no, I don't have 12 minutes. And when I say really, but I'm like, okay, you don't have 12 minutes. Do you make a cup of coffee in the morning? How long does that take? Oh, 3 minutes. Great. That's your first 3 minutes. Can you break up the 12 minutes in four segments, of 3 minutes or vice versa? And transition times, walking to class, commuting, if you're on the train, these are all great opportunities to practice some sort of breath focused meditation or loving kindness meditation. Give yourself the 12 minutes. And then when people say that they have trouble sleeping, I'm like, oh, great. You should really try a body scan. 20 minutes long, get it on an app, find it on YouTube before you go to bed, right? So you start to kind of, introduce it into places that make sense in your daily life.
That that's a beautiful approach because I think of the perfectionist or the high achiever who doesn't want to sacrifice that 12 minutes, but you're right, you're waiting for the coffee or you're walking down the hall. Like there are so many opportunities that you can integrate it that maybe will feel more accessible if someone's just not there yet to like set aside the block of time. 12 minutes, I mean, that's totally feasible, but you'd be surprised how many people feel like that's not, like it's not accessible yet. So to break it up throughout the day, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm so intrigued by this entire conversation. I'm having a great time. But I do want to talk a little bit about your evolve method. So you mentioned earlier you created this method kind of based on what had been working and the ways to move people through this process. And I have your book right here. And I was very intrigued by the inner resources that emerge through this work of inner worth, which I think we've touched to just a little bit. We're starting to circle around that, inner leadership, and then inner humanity. So I was curious if you'd be willing to, one, talk us through the evolve process, and then maybe can we touch on some of these inner resources and how those emerge through this healing through perfectionism process?
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, we psychologists love acronyms, right? They're easy to remember. And when I was mapping out, I mean, I didn't have an acronym when I began, but I just was figuring out what are the logical steps in helping people who struggle with perfectionism learn how to basically relax, be kinder to themselves, be more hopeful about their futures, be able to tolerate uncertainty. And so I really began with the basics, like, being aware of the present moment, grounding yourself, things like that. So eventually it netted out to an acronym that actually shares a lot of the same letters. So it's evolved. So E is really the first step, and that's embodying the present moment, like we were talking about. And and when those skills are in place, they become foundational to when you get to sort of like the next step, which is V, which is validate your experience.
Mm,
So one of the things that perfectionists tend to do, and I'm really saying the garden variety, like all the different types, is because there's this need to be in control all the time, you're not really connected to the feelings or the challenges, right? It's almost like I was actually talking to a client today where it's almost like she's inoculated to anything positive. Like
mm,
her brain just won't even take it in, right? But to now turn towards these experiences, name them. Like this is hard, or I didn't expect this. And and that takes a little bit of, it should be vulnerability. It could be validate your experience or vulnerability, and both work, they work.
both work. Yeah.
And so, so it is kind of sometimes I say it's like remedial training and empathy for the self
Mm,
at this point, because you really want to say this is hard. It's hard to want to do all these things. It's hard to feel like you're going to fail at every turn. So validation is a really important process. And then the third step is O, which is open your heart. And this is when I start to really introduce the compassion practices and even define self-compassion, because many people are like, what is self-compassion? I don't do that. Being nice to myself. So I'm sort of like treading lightly, right? So then it's okay how to be kinder to yourself. And this is actually where groups are so good, because when people help each other, it hones it in, it makes it real for them. And then L is love your inner critic. So when people start like opening up their heart and they're kinder to themselves, or they're, and they think, no, this is weakness, I'm going to let myself off the hook too easily. I'll give in. That's where the resistance comes in. And then when you notice the resistance, that's usually the inner critic. So that's why the fourth step is, love your inner critic. Like that, the inner critic is based, I think the inner critic's like a heart palpitation. It's like a little tweak. It's like a warning signal that, oh, something might be off, or maybe something is going to go wrong. How is that inner narrative that you have developed probably pretty well since at least middle school, trying to help you in some way? And this can be a hard step for people to identify their inner narrative. I mean, even yesterday in this group, this young woman was saying, I curse at myself all the time. I'm really mean. I tell myself that I'm stupid. She's at Harvard. She's not stupid, right? But this is so common. I hear this day in and day out. And we were actually doing this naming exercise of identifying the inner narrative, naming the inner critic. And another student was able to identify um, her third grade self
mm,
when a teacher pointed something out, but she took it as like a criticism, like that she didn't do a good job. And that is still like this little mini trauma in her nervous system that 20 years later is still there. But now she was able to see, oh, that's a body memory. That is a traumatic memory that has been filed into my hippocampus, and she's still there. oh, she's just trying to warn me so I don't make a mistake. That makes total sense from a 10-year-old part, right? So all of a sudden, we're starting to extract the bits and pieces of perfectionism. So it's my favorite step is loving your inner critic because it's the hardest for people, but I feel like that's where almost the most change or shift happens.
It's so
And then,
powerful.
yeah,
I just to like stop you for a second, like loving that part of you that's trying to keep you safe. Like that's a big hurdle, I feel like to overcome that. And I mean I can feel it in my heart and my body right now, just thinking of all of those younger versions that got the criticism or the snap response and that, you know, that body feeling of oh no, I've done something wrong or I am wrong or whatever it might be, those stories and the way that that just carries with you and your inner critic is trying to protect you. Like what a beautiful thing it's trying to do.
yeah,
Uh,
just doesn't have the skills, doesn't know the skills. So, as an aside, a little hack for this is, and it's always so surprising how people respond, but I went totally off script on the mindfulness class because of a story that somebody was sharing, and she was just really being hard on herself because at week 4 of mindfulness, she was still having a hard time with it. Like it's just a very typical, normal feeling. But she was just, the bar was raised so high for her on trying to do it right, and then she was lamenting, and then I started talking about self-compassion, and I said, when did this sort of inner narrative show up in your life? And she said, oh, it's been, I was born with it, like something like that, something radical. I'm like, okay, you weren't born with it, but go back and try to remember it. And I said, do you have a picture of your younger self? She's like, oh my gosh, my baby pictures are beautiful. She was so funny. She's from another country. She had this thick accent, and she's like, oh, I love my baby pictures. I'm like, great. Can you put that as your screensaver on your phone? So it's the first thing that you look at every morning and direct some kind wishes towards yourself. She started to cry. And then of course, and then some of the other members were like, oh my gosh. I'm like, yeah, listen, you could have a photo of your 12-year-old self, your 16-year-old self, your 21-year-old self, because you had hard experiences and different narratives show up at different times and different coping skills show up at different times. And so we really do have to kind of soften into that our habits are there for a reason. And when we can see that they were constructed as a way to protect you, even if it wasn't the best strategy, it was the only one you knew at the time,
right.
right? So, and then the last two steps, I'll just make them quick. V is make a vow, which is really sort of that commitment step. So when you start to make these changes, you really do need to be accountable to yourself or bring in an accountability partner. I mean, when we're making these changes, we need supports in any way that we can get them, especially perfectionists who tend to be, in a way, kind of like loners, when it comes to their own achievement, and they're striving. So it's to kind of, make that vow, that commitment to yourself. And then the last E was actually an add-on as I was writing the book, which surprised me. And that is energy, sparking the energies for excellence.
Mm,
And I have a whole little story about that we can get into, but this is when I was kind of almost full circle coming back to the first E, which is embody the present moment. But now I introduce some energy psychology, tapping, the internal,
mm.
not the internal family systems, that's part of the inner critic, but a little light sort of acupressure tapping that you can do, little skills to help just calm the nervous system that come from these other traditions. And so, again, the renegade mind body part of me had to kind of slip that in at the end, but it finished out the word evolve. And so I was very happy about it.
I love that. And I also love the way that you kind of frame up that we can still cultivate this excellence or the energy of excellence and that you don't have to, abandon that part of yourself, that part of you that wants quality isn't bad. It's not just like far to this side or far to that side where suddenly you don't care about anything anymore. There's this way to honor that.
Absolutely. It's an important value, right? So part of that step on making a vow is identifying your values. And so, You know, for some people that might be success, security, it could be anything, family, excellence. It's a value and it's important, and we don't want to dismiss it.
Mm. I also love that you brought in the energy work. That makes me excited to read the end of the book. I haven't gotten all the way through yet, but I had a therapist that I worked with many years ago, and she was a licensed therapist, I think at a master's level, but she also was certified in some kind of energy work that I had never heard of at that time. And we did some tapping and stuff in my work with her to help me through some like triggering things that were happening at that time. And I remember just getting totally different nervous system response after being able to work through like the cognitive, but also the
Yeah.
physical together. It was really powerful. So I love that you integrated that.
Yeah. And people, they do no harm, first of all, and people like doing them because it gives them like, so it's a good complement to mindfulness, right? Which is often very sort of solitary, you're sitting quietly. And if that's too hard, I then go to, a little tapping protocol, which you can do on an app these days, or, and just follow along because it gives people something to do with their hands. But it actually is sending these sort of electromagnetic signals to the brain to calm the limbic system, like bonus, right? So
Yes, I love it. Multi-tiered
yes,
benefits.
exactly.
Okay, so we have this method. Thank you for outlining each of those steps. I'm still like the love the inner critic. That's gonna have my heart. But I want to talk about because we're getting close. I can't believe how quick this
Mhm.
conversation is going. Talk to me about inner worth, inner leadership, and inner humanity. And we can kind of maybe just touch on each of them briefly to know
Yeah.
how does this practice and this work that you do move people from this place of perfectionism where you're really harming yourself through these habits and routines to you do this work and now you've cultivated these really powerful inner resources.
Well, my perspective is that we all are born with the potential for these inner resources, right? So I just happen to identify in this sort of small domain of perfectionism, inner resources that people don't necessarily connect with right away. So inner worth is this basic sense of being okay, and when you're cultivating this sense of inner worth, you're treating yourself with respect and care. You're allowing yourself to, make mistakes, but still love yourself along the way. And, people can identify with like, oh, I've got, low self-worth. Well, the seeds are there. They've just been obscured, by all of these other challenges or limiting beliefs that have been, sort of accumulated over time. And the inner leadership is really being self-led in a way, is knowing that you have the capability to sort of literally be the captain of your own life, that you can learn from failures, you can strive. It requires sort of almost like a purpose, like a compass in a way, and also a lot of courage. And people are always looking for skills. Like, I need to accumulate all of this, I don't know, these credentials and these skills in order to be a good leader. And I like to flip the script on that and say, no, that the leadership starts with yourself and really cultivating that. And I do think that when perfectionists can sort of transform their reliance on external validation to really cultivate self-trust, that's really inner leadership.
Mm.
And then inner humanity is really, I use the word humanity as like compassion, right? So inner humanity is another way of saying self-compassion. And it is such a powerful antidote to shame, which we all experience. It's shame is something that keeps us hidden and small, but when we can direct compassion to those parts, like we were just talking about, you start to cultivate this inner humanity. So those are like the just three of many inner strengths that one person, can cultivate over time. But like, resilience is an inner strength too, right? I could say all of these are also parts of resilience, but I like to focus on the inner worth and the inner leadership and the inner humanity because it kind of encompasses a lot of these skills and the evolve method.
Yeah. Yeah, I just thought that was so beautiful. I appreciate you unpacking a little bit. It's all of these lovely gifts that are on the other side of doing this healing work and embracing, as you said, all of these parts that are, doing their best
Yes,
to help move you forward and keep you safe, and sometimes they just need some support and some skill.
exactly. Yeah.
Oh, we've gone so many amazing places. Is there anywhere that you hoped we'd go that we didn't, or anything that you really feel like you would like to share with our listeners before we wrap up?
I would say if there's anything that you take away from this conversation, which has been lovely, is to notice the inner narratives, notice what part might be activated, and to give it a name, like a little nickname. So I have a part of me that arose when I was very young, growing up in a very chaotic household. I was very temperamental, I was a temper tantrum kid. And that part comes forward when I feel like the world is unjust. And she happens to be coming forward a lot lately. But I call her Scarlet, because that's sort of that red anger. I'm like, oh, that's my Scarlet. And she is really activated now. But when I can identify that that's what's getting activated, then I'm not mad at myself. I'm not going to make, some sort of big mistake. I'm like, oh my gosh, my Scarlet is so activated right now, and she just needs to calm down, right? So it's helpful sometimes to name these parts when they come up. So that's the invitation to your listeners is, when you notice that inner critical narrative, can you give it a name? Can you identify maybe how long it's been around? When did it show up? How do you feel toward it? Maybe you don't like it at all, but is it trying to help you? Is it protective in some way, even if it's using a skill that a 10-year-old would use?
Mm. Yeah. I love that. And I know we didn't dig into IFS explicitly, but we kind of implicitly have woven
Mhm.
it through the whole episode.
Yeah,
So I think that's a beautiful way to end, to just invite that naming of the parts and
yeah,
that recognition, and yeah, give us a way to relate to them and recognize them when they show up.
yes.
Yeah. Ugh, what a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much. Where can people find you if they want to read the book, if they want to follow you?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, so my name, which is, hopefully going to be in your show notes, TaraCousineau.com. That's my main website. Then the book, The Perfectionist Dilemma, you can find on any, online book retailer. And then there's also a website for the book called perfectionistdilemma.com. I also am starting a new newsletter in Substack called The Peaceful Perfectionist. So that's just getting off the ground. But yeah, people can
The,
find me online. Yeah.
the Peaceful Perfectionist. I love
Yeah.
that.
Yes.
Amazing. Yes, we will put all of the links in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time, your energy, your wisdom, your knowledge. This has been such a great conversation, deeply healing for both present Kayla and Kayla of 21 years old that was just beginning
Yeah.
this this journey. Thank you for all you do and for sharing this today.
Oh,
I'm so excited to share it out.
yeah. Thank you. And thank you for your questions. It's a lovely conversation.
Anytime. Well, for everyone who's listening, I hope that you can find something from this that called to you, an invitation that you can bring forward in your life to be a little more loving, a little more kind, a little more integrated, whatever spoke to you. Just pick a small place to start and take care of yourselves out there. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. If you want more resources on thriving in your life or want details on working with me, check out my website at internallyguidedleadership.com or follow me on Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok at Internally Guided Coach. Be gentle with yourselves out there, and I'll talk to you next time.